It's hard to say why Nietzsche is so influential in some ways, because it's been pointed out that his thought is idiosyncratic. It's his own thought. So the question has been asked, how can someone who is so individual in his way of thinking, so distinctive, affect so many people? And there's always an element that's incalculable here, I think. But Nietzsche, I think, spoke for things that were already going on, articulated things going on. There was a sense when he wrote that Christianity has come to an end in terms of intellectual respectability. And Nietzsche succeeded in saying, well, the next step is this. Let's get rid, he said, specifically of Christian morality. And I actually think that one reason he's so influential is that Nietzsche pushes hard to get us to understand the implications of what he called the death of God. Belief in God is intellectually discredited, God is dead, now let's get rid of morality also. And I think that because he thought along those lines, it caught something in the atmosphere in his day, and has caught something in the atmosphere since his day as well. Nietzsche actually came from a pious Lutheran home. It's hard to gauge maybe the extent to which it was a conventional piety or very lively piety, but his father actually was a pastor, a Lutheran pastor, and he lost his father just before he was 5 years old. Some books say he was 5. Actually, Nietzsche was born late in the year, so they mistake that. He was actually only 4 when he lost his father. And Nietzsche was very, very fond of his father and grieved for his father for years and years afterwards. Still in his teen years, he would talk about remembering the sound of the church bells and the sound of the hymn they sang when his father died at his father's funeral. So he was surrounded also by women. Now, people have made a lot of that, as you can imagine. There are psychological interpretations. There are aunts, grandmother, mother. So people have said, well, this influenced him. The fact he didn't have a father figure when he grew up. I leave aside psychological interpretation. Just to stick to the facts, he knew also a lot of sorrow when he was small because a brother died in infancy, other members of the family died. Then Nietzsche proceeded to school. He was born not far from Leipzig, and he went to school elsewhere, and he imbibed the classical world, the world of classical studies, Greek and Latin, and he loved that. He saw in this world something which attracted him very, very deeply. The cult, I think, of the autonomous, free-thinking, courageous Greek appealed to him immensely. He became a very good classical student, as a matter of fact, then went to university, and after university was appointed extremely young to a chair of classical philology in Basel. Not only appointed young, but he was appointed without undergoing the usual statutory examinations you had to undergo in order to have that position. He was there for 10 years officially, but I say officially because, as a matter of fact, he had to have breaks because of his ill health. He was plagued by ill health through a great deal of his life. He was pensioned off in 1879 after a 10-year period there, and then he wandered around Europe, Switzerland and Italy to a large extent, just living a wandering life. So it was a very solitary life that he lived. Nietzsche then, in 1889, he underwent a severe mental collapse. Textbooks often say that what happened was he saw a cart horse being flogged on the streets in Turin. Probably that happened, but we can't be absolutely certain. Anyway, according to the textbooks, he saw the horse being flogged. He ran, embraced the horse's head, and collapsed, sobbing, which echoes, as a matter of fact, a story in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And Nietzsche was reading Dostoevsky. So it's intriguing, if one can use a word which is so cold, for what must have been a poignant event if it happened. Anyway, he didn't recover sanity. After 1889, he was clinically, I suppose the appropriate word was mentally unbalanced. And then he died in 1900. Now, Nietzsche had a sister. And his sister was married to someone who was strongly fascist. They actually went out to Paraguay at a certain stage, and they formed or joined some sort of colony there. She was very right-wing. Her husband was very right-wing. He died. And she, when she returned to the family household, Nietzsche's sister began, as it were, to take command when Nietzsche was ill. And she would apparently let guests in to see him. He became a kind of celebrity in the last decade of his life. She would let guests in to see him, looking at him lying down there, as though he was some sort of demigod in deep thought. And the man, of course, was in a state of mental collapse. And it was Elizabeth, his sister, really, that promulgated the line that Nietzsche was a kind of proto-fascist, because she gathered up his materials in certain ways, sought to edit them in certain ways. And whatever may be said of the connection between Nietzsche and Nazism, whatever may be said about that, she certainly actually directed people's thinking and reading in that way. Nietzsche's first explicitly anti-Christian book was Human, All Too Human. And he comes out there with a severe criticism of Christianity, along with talking about a whole host of other things. But I think what people don't realize is that there is an essential background to this, and the kind of attractions that Nietzsche had, the kind of hopes for his culture, were ones that were already setting him on collision course with Christianity. He loved the world of the Greeks, studied the Greeks in detail, found the Greeks to be bringers of a culture which somehow had disappeared in Europe. Why had it disappeared? Well, he could trace it back to certain tendencies in Greek culture itself, but mainly it was because of Christianity. Because the Renaissance could have brought back a renaissance of Greek culture, whether directly or through, first of all, celebrating Roman culture and then coming on to the Greeks. But Christianity killed the Renaissance. The Germans, specifically, he says, are the ones who kill this marvelous opportunity which the Renaissance gave people to celebrate human creativity, human beauty, all those things. Now, Nietzsche, therefore, found himself wanting to become involved in a project for cultural renewal in Germany. And the key man for that in the 1870s was Wagner, the 60s and 70s, which is when Nietzsche encountered him. And he found in Wagner actually a father figure. Wagner was born in the same year as was Nietzsche's father, apparently resembled him in appearance. And Wagner wanted to revitalize what he thought was a decadent European culture. And there's a vibrancy about what Wagner was up to. Wagner is still hugely influential culturally. Nietzsche considered seriously giving up his position, teaching philology in Basel, in order to help raise funds for Wagner's establishment of the opera house, the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth. And he just longed to see a cultural renaissance where there was a celebration of humanity, none of this dark Christianity. Another figure that influenced him was Schopenhauer. Actually, Schopenhauer influenced him before Wagner did, and one thing that drew Nietzsche to Wagner was the fact that Wagner was keen on Schopenhauer as well. And Schopenhauer, as a matter of fact, Schopenhauer was not critical of Christianity in all respects. Schopenhauer held that Christianity was correct to emphasize human love, and Nietzsche later broke with that. But Schopenhauer was bleakly pessimistic. And Schopenhauer thought that at the heart of the world order, there is some phenomenon called will, not a personal will like a Christian God, but some force which is powerful, which surges through nature and life. And the combination of pessimism on Schopenhauer's part and Schopenhauer's celebration of the aesthetic dimension of human life, because Schopenhauer thought the way to escape the clutches of the reality which we caught is aesthetic observation, aesthetic delight. That combination appealed to Nietzsche immensely. All of this, of course, was in stark contrast with Christianity. Schopenhauer was atheistic, reacting against Christianity. Wagner's complex, but he certainly had contempt for anything like traditional Christianity. Whether at the end of his days he came to some sort of accommodation with some form of Christianity is hard to say. But when he did that, Nietzsche had broken with him, had disagreed with him, and scoffed at Wagner and hated Wagner for the fact that Wagner compromised at all with Christianity, as he did do right at the end of his life. Nietzsche's first book was called The Birth of Tragedy, From the Spirit of Music. And of it, looking back at it, he said it displays towards Christianity a profound hostile silence. And certainly that book doesn't deal with Christianity directly. But what Nietzsche does is interesting in that book, because Nietzsche thought that if you understood Greek culture properly, that the Greeks, far from being a people who are simply serene, simply happy and joyful, they knew the depths of suffering. And he worked out a thesis in relation to this, whereby he interpreted Greek drama, and specifically the role of the chorus in Greek drama. Now, that's quite technical material, but what's interesting about it is that as far as Nietzsche is concerned, it's when people like Socrates came along and tried to say that we must view the world in terms of virtue, happiness, reason, these are the commanding forces. Nietzsche said, no, indeed, life is not like that. If you try to rationalize life, to moralize life, you are already going against life. So as far as he was concerned, his thesis about tragedy was an attempt to get at what was deep, deep, deep in Greek culture, which was the realization that existence involves suffering. And his hope was that there would be cultural renewal when this tragedy was realized, when people realized, in other words, that Greek tragic drama is what really tells us most about the Greeks. The Greeks understood the human condition. Then along comes Socrates, along come people like Plato who talk about some ideal world behind this world. Along comes Christianity, although Nietzsche doesn't deal with it in this particular book. Later on, along comes Christianity, which, says Nietzsche scornfully, is Platonism for the people. In other words, they believe at a popular level, rather than intellectual level like Plato, that there is another world, a greater world, a heavenly world, which makes this world unreal. And it was written at a time when Nietzsche had high hopes, as a matter of fact, for the enterprise of Wagner. That was his very first book. What Nietzsche does in The Birth of Tragedy is to contrast two figures, Apollo and Dionysus, from the pantheon of Greek deities, and working things out in a fairly technical argument, yet fairly brief argument as well. What Nietzsche wants to say is that Apollo and Dionysus stand for different drives in the Greeks. Now you can trace these drives back to certain physiological conditions, dream, for example, and intoxication. But Apollo stands for artistic form. Dionysus stands for suffering existence. Dionysus is the one who immerses himself in suffering existence. He is a tragic god. Now, what happens then in Greek culture is that the outward form, the craftsmanship of the literature, he's talking about specific periods and he goes into detail, the craftsmanship is an Apollonian work. That is to say, you give form to the culture, to literature, to drama, to music. But the underlying reality, it is embedded in Dionysus. So there's an Apollonian form, different words are sometimes used, Apolline, but Apollonian form to a suffering, tragic existence, symbolized by the god Dionysus. And Nietzsche thought of himself as the disciple of Dionysus. In fact, when Nietzsche went insane at the end of his life, he signed himself occasionally Dionysus. Then he would sign himself the crucified, talking about Jesus. But the contrast in the early days was between Dionysus and Apollo, later between Dionysus and Jesus, the crucified one. The first book in which Nietzsche comes out explicitly against Christianity is Human, All Too Human. And much of that can be read, as a matter of fact, as a classic rationalist objection to Christianity. That is to say, following in the footsteps of Voltaire, and he connected that book with an anniversary of Voltaire. Following the footsteps of Voltaire, he regards Christianity as rational nonsense. Who can ever believe now Christian doctrines about the virgin birth, Jesus as the Son of God, for example? But although you can connect him there with other rationalistic and atheistic streams, although Voltaire himself never got to the atheist position, actually, still he was anti-Christian, was Voltaire. Although you can connect Nietzsche up with those things, there is something there which is harder than much of the atheism of his time. And you see it when Nietzsche talks about the Christian view of humanity. In Human All Too Human, Nietzsche talks about the way in which Christians bury humans, as it were, in mud. They regard humans as miserable little worms, and then humans cry out gratefully to God because of all his grace. And Nietzsche hates that. Now, you've had that before, but there's a passion in Nietzsche which is quite distinctive. However, after Human All Too Human, Nietzsche begins to develop what become more characteristically Nietzschean ways of thought, ways of thought which are really Nietzsche distinctively, rather than linking him to the past. And this is where I think we encounter his conclusion that God has died. Nietzsche says, God is dead. As far as he's concerned, intellectual culture knows that. But philosophers are pussyfooting around Christianity, trying to salvage something from the wreck of the death of God. They shouldn't try to do that. God is dead, but this is a cataclysmic event in European history. Who's realized it? Who's realized the significance? People are atheists, but they don't know what has happened. The whole center of life has disappeared. We are like people spinning, whirling through a vortex now. That's the way Nietzsche thinks. Now, Nietzsche's later literature then is really devoted to working out what this means in practice. The death of God, he announces in a significant way. There is a shadow of it before. Actually, in Human All Too Human, there's a reference to it. But he announces that in a significant way in a book often translated The Gay Science. I think now we have to give up on that translation because the word gay, as Nietzsche used it, well, of course, it's a translation from his German. The word gay means merry, happy, light-hearted. He announces the death of God there in a big way. But before that, and after Human All Too Human, he'd written a book called Daybreak, which is Thoughts on the Prejudices of Morality. And this is where Nietzsche really is going, because morality remains even though God is dead. Now, there's something very, very wrong here. And Nietzsche recalls a fable. He recalls that after the death of Buddha, it was said of Buddha that his shadow remained on the cave for a long time afterwards, a particular cave where he lodged, I guess. Now, says Nietzsche, this is the situation with the death of God. God is dead, but the shadow remains. What is the shadow? Christian morality. And we have to vanquish that shadow. So Nietzsche's crusade against Christianity then, as it develops in the writings from Daybreak onwards, through The Gay Science, I'll still call it that, through his big work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and forwards, on from there, his crusade is against Christian morality more than anything, because Christian morality is oppressive. It talks to you about another world to whose laws you are supposed to be subject, which means you demean this world, you demean what is natural, and this is what we absolutely must get rid of. And Nietzsche says, you know, says Nietzsche, who the people are, he says at one point in one of his later works, do you know who the people are who try to retain Christian morality without Christian belief in God? The English. It's the English who do that. George Eliot, the novelist, she thinks you can have Christian morality without Christian God. Nonsense. Christianity is a system. You can't simply take Christian morality, having left behind the Christian God. It's one great, dreadful objectivity. But the English, they think they can keep on the morality without the religion. So Nietzsche's work becomes directed to a large extent against Christian morality. And he makes a statement which I think is most illuminating for his program. In fact, if I had to select a single statement that captures what Nietzsche is really up to, a statement which is an insight as well, I think, I would select it from the book we translate as The Gay Science, when Nietzsche says this. Nietzsche says, what is now decisive against Christianity is not our reasons, but our taste. At one time, perhaps it was reasons, but we've gone past that point. That story's ended, or should have ended. What really matters now is our taste. We hate this stuff. It's not simply irrational, which it is. Every right-thinking person knows that, but it's hateful. So spit out of your mouth this Christian morality business. And that then is something he takes right through to the climax of his work. And before his death, he was talking about his hatred of Christianity. He called himself the Antichrist, although in German that can be translated the anti-Christian, but I think the Antichrist is what Nietzsche is really saying here. He called himself the Antichrist because it was a collision of values he was talking about. And if he had had life, he would have worked out some kind of constructive philosophy, by the look of it, on the revaluation of all values. We've got to get rid of the old values, but we've got to create new ones. That brings in what he thought was his great work, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche is also mistaken, I think, when he conceives of Christianity as something which is a purely otherworldly hope. Now, Christians themselves in the churches have criticized those who speak in those terms. And that is the point. Christians themselves have made that criticism. In other words, it doesn't belong to Christianity to be purely otherworldly. So when in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the figure of Zarathustra says, let us love the earth, let us be true to the earth, forget other worlds, Christians want to say, look, at the heart of Christianity is the mandate to love God with heart, soul, strength and mind, and our neighbour as ourselves, which is a thoroughly this-worldly program of social transformation. Now, Nietzsche actually objects to that in certain ways as well, because he thought that things like democracy and socialism had risen out of Christianity. They were terribly egalitarian, and Nietzsche thinks humans aren't equals. He thinks there's some great ones. But at least he should have understood that Christianity is not really an otherworldly religion. It does believe in another world, but not to the exclusion of belief in the importance of this world. And yet he seems to think the Christians do not love the earth as they should, because they believe in another world as well. That shouldn't be the case. Christians should be able to hold both in equal esteem, as it were.